Hey, what's up guys and welcome back to askNK. This is our weekly rundown of events, updates and beautiful things happening within the Blender community, Blender Foundation and also Blender as an app. And this week we do have a couple of cool things, interesting things actually, that you guys will definitely want to take a look at. First off, the Blender World Meetup Day is happening. So just in case you want to follow up on this, you can simply go over to the link in the description and take a look at what's going on. And this is happening today, the 20th of March 2021. Now, in case you want to see the groups, the people speaking and the topic they're speaking on, the time they will be speaking, it is also very interesting to see that there's a schedule right here that you can catch up with. But just in case maybe it's nighttime where you are right now and you probably would go to sleep, you can always catch up with these things on YouTube, because right here there's a YouTube channel where this is actually streaming on at this point. So I'm going to put a link in the description so that you guys can catch up with that. Now with this said, there's a couple of new updates that's now available in Blender 2.93, and for sure we would go through and take a look at this right now. So with Blender 2.93 simply open the alpha, there's a lot of cool things. First off, we're going to talk about the UI. So the UI right now looks pretty the same, like you guys probably have seen from previous weeks, but then there's a tiny update to it. So that tiny update lives right here. So if you actually take a look at your UI, you would notice that we have the collection properties as a pretty cool thing right here. So what does this mean, and what's the role of this? What this actually does is getting some of the functions that exist here, but simply putting them right over here so that you would be able to access these things easily. If, for example, you don't want any of these things within a certain collection to be selectable, you can turn this off. And then for some reason, if you'd like them, not to be visible within the render, you can also turn this on. So how to test this is by simply hitting the render button right here, hit on the render image, and you would notice that we have our object. But then if we don't want these things to be visible within the render, we can simply turn this on, and you would also notice that because this property is tied over to this one, automatically this also is disabled. So if we turn this on, you get to see that. If we turn it off, you get to see it. All right, so you can now see these things right here at the same time. So let's actually take a look at the render. So if we turn that on and go over to render image, you notice we don't see anything. And then you can also choose to have handouts. So handouts are basically, having some sort of transparency. So in case you want to do some composition, it's going to be very easy for you. And you can actually have these things here. So we can go over to render image, and now you have these things. You would also notice there's an instancing happening there. And now you notice there's line art. So what is this line art, and how does this work? So the line art is basically something that we've talked about previously that is in Blender, and they're actually working on it even way better to make it to the final build of Blender 2.93. If you guys remember properly, the last time we talked about anything that had to do with line, we did say that if you simply select an object right now in Blender and right click and go all the way to where you have the convert, you can easily convert these things to G.Pencil. And this actually blew a lot of you guys' mind, and it's very interesting to see that they've capitalized on this thing and even made it way better. So the freestyle line art, G.Pencil thing looks better right now. So what do I mean? If we hold down Shift and tap A on the keyboard and you go over to the G.Pencil, you would now notice that there are three new options here. The first one is the scene line art, the collection line art, and also the object line art. So this object line art is only tied to a given object, and the scene line art is tied to the scene. And there's a couple of things that you guys need to know about this one, which I'm going to go through and explain. You notice we brought in Suzanne the monkey, and with Suzanne the monkey right here, you would notice that we don't get to see this line art everywhere. Now the reason why is because we're not looking at this through the camera, and even looking at it through the camera at this point, you'd also notice that some of those parts don't even have it. So how do we make sure that Suzanne has the entire line art that we're looking for? All we need to do is press tab on the keyboard, switch over to where we have the edges, right click and say mark, and click on mark freestyle edges. And once you do that and press the tab key and jump all the way out, you now notice we have this. It's very essential to note that these line art are mostly visible in their totality when you're looking at them through the camera. Because at this point, if we go around the object, you would notice that we don't get to see it. But if we're looking at it through the camera, it's very interesting to see that you'll be able to see that. And let's actually tie this camera to the view. So we'll go over to the view section, click on that, press N on the keyboard, and at this point we can now go around and you'll be able to see this thing. So what this now means is you can have an entire scene just simply made of these things. And by the way, once you add this line art, automatically if you go over to, if you go over to the object property, to the modifier section, you would notice that you have the line art modifier. Just in case you don't want to see these 3D objects, you can turn them off and you'll be left with the line art. So with this said, if we go back to what we were discussing earlier, which has to do with the collection property, you can now use this collection property to include or exclude certain things. So for example, the line art, you can actually do that. So if we click on exclude, what happens is we go over to the render and render this, you would notice that there is no line art that is added to this particular collection. So you can use this to your advantage and actually do a lot of cool things. If you want to include this, you can also turn that inclusion there and go over to the render section and you will be able to do some pretty cool things with this. So this now makes a lot of sense. But something else which makes a whole lot of sense as well that deals with the collection and line art is this. So for example, let's say you want to create some sort of particles, okay? So let's say you want to create some particles and all you need to do is just simply get a grid and let's go over to the particle system, throw in that particle right there, and we'll go over to where we have the render, and within the render we're just simply going to change this to object, simply select that cube. Now once we select the cube, we'll go over to where we have the field weight and we're just going to turn gravity all the way down. Now let's press the playback button so that you guys can see what we have, and you can see these lovely cubes just simply traveling. Now what do we need, or what do we want to do? So what we want to do is relatively simple. Let's just go there, scale this cube a little bit, press H on the keyboard to hide that. So what we want to do is pretty simple. If we hold down Shift and tap A and go over to the grease pencil, you guys remember that when we did this earlier, we did see the scene line art, object line art, and the collection line art as the options that we have. And yep, we can now use the collection line art to actually throw, line art across an entire particle system. So if we go in and switch over to the camera, press the home key and press N on the keyboard and tie this to the view. Okay, so at this point, we can now use this and actually get some pretty interesting things. So we can just press the playback button and you can see all of these things happening, and depending on what you want, you can go in and make some changes. So for the line art as well, if you go over to the modifier section, for those who might want to play with the style, of course you can play with the thickness, you can reduce the thickness as well. And like we talked about in the previous weeks, if you go over to where you have the effects, you can throw in a couple of effects for that. And within the modifier section as well, you can also choose to play with some of the modifiers, that exist right here. So these are some pretty cool things that you can do with these things. And of course, it just simply makes sense to see that we have this right here in Blender. Now, while we talk about the things that we have right here in Blender, there's a couple of cool updates that are now here for the geometry node. So we did a video that talks about the geometry node and how, some of the things that we kind of want to see, and also some of the cool things that's available right now. And it's very interesting to see that there are more updates on that. So if you go over to the geometry nodes right now, you would notice that there's a couple of cool attributes that have been added. So if I just simply select this object and click right here, there's a couple of cool attributes that have been added, and they comprise of the attribute convert and also the attribute remove. So in case you want to remove an attribute, you can actually do that. If you would like to convert an attribute from one to another, you can also do that. Now there's also some pretty cool things that we also talked about, that is now here, that deals with the mesh. And I did get a couple of questions from you guys asking how to work with the line in case you want to scatter things, and that is pretty simple. So by default, when you want to scatter things across your geometry, how you get to do this is you get the point density, okay? So we get the PD and you get to drop that, and that's the point distribute, sorry. And then you get the point instance and you drop that as well. And from this part is where you get to start doing some cool stuff. And for a good example, what we have here is we can simply select Suzanne and then we have all of that there, okay? Now, if you choose to do this with something else, so let's say we choose to do this with, let's just get something else like a simple cylinder. I think a cylinder is cool. If we do this with a simple cylinder, you get a good result. But then you guys might have tried this and noticed that there's a simple problem when you choose to go through the same route by simply using a line. That doesn't happen. All right, so by default, lines are made of individual points, and because these points are only happening between the edges all the way to the vertices, which actually forms the line, it simply means that you don't need to have that distribute. You simply just need to wire this from one point, which is from this geometry section, over to this geometry to have something like this. And for those who might want to actually push things a little bit further, you can go in and get the point translate, okay? And we can throw in that point translate right here and simply use position to actually move things a little bit forward. You would also notice that there's a count here, which you can use to increase things and reduce things depending on what you want. And you might also want to explore trying this line or using the line for a couple of things. So let's say, for example, you want to get things like the points to volume. So let's get that point to volume right there. And you might want to also try out the volume to what? To mesh. All right. So we can try out these ones. We can connect one, connect this other one right here, and right over here. With a simple line like this, you can start making some pretty cool things. Now, this is not just where it ends. Let's back up a bit and just take a look at something that I want to show you guys. And what I would like to show you guys is the fact that you can now drag things from here right over to this point. So let's say, for example, you would want to get your lights right here. You want to distribute your light across several parts. Yes, you can actually do that. And if you would like to also drag in the cube, you can also do that as well. So we did talk about some of these things. And for those who would like to take a look, there's going to be a link in the description that'll take you over to the requests that we want to see for the geometry nodes and some of the things that are available for the geometry nodes right now. Now, with this said, if you also split this in half and switch over to where you have your spreadsheet, which is something that we talked about as well, you would notice that within the spreadsheet that we have a section right here that deals with instancing. So if you take a look at the instancing, because we are now instancing Suzanne, you would notice that we have a lot of instances of her. Now, previously what we did have was just the mesh and also the point cloud, but it's very interesting to see that you can now read up your instances and see how these things get to work. At this point, you can see that we have a count of 14 and we have that same here for starting all the way from 0 all the way to 13, and that is, you know, how you can now count and also use your instances. So this is pretty lovely. And of course, because the line tool is here, or the line geometry is here, there's going to be a couple of cool and lovely things they can now easily create with this. Let's take a look at the grease pencil. Last week when we talked about the grease pencil, we talked about the auto keying feature, which is something that looks pretty nice. I love the fact that this exists. And now there is the interpolation tool. So how does this work? By default, if you go in and you do a simple drawing like that, go over to frame 40, and let's say you do another one. I'm just gonna write a big G or C. I don't know what I did. All right, so we're just gonna write something like that. You get a part of me. I'm working with the mouse here. So what we have here is a an A and a G, okay? An A and a G like kind of thing. So what we'll have here is these two objects. So before now, how you get to work with interpolation is simple. You go over to draw sequence, and you can do that. This is something that you could do. But now with this tool, you can actually tell what the interpolation is going to look like even before you commit to it. And this is going to be very good for hand turning, head turning, whole body turning and stuff like that. So if we simply, go over to a frame like this, try and make sure you're not within this frame, all right? Stay within a simple frame, and then if you go like so, you can notice that this object turns to that, okay? And one thing to also keep in mind, just like you might have noticed, one thing to also keep in mind is your stroke needs to be a whole stroke. For this example, by simply taking a look at this, you would notice that because we added this extra stuff, we can't actually capture that. So if I go in and do it one more time, you would notice that we can't capture that because it's an extra stuff. But if you do have like one whole stroke, it's definitely going to simply conform to that. So let's undo that, and I'm just going to go in and do something else. So maybe I could select the draw tool, and we're just going to write a simple Z and go all the way to the middle, select this object, and now you can do things like this. Now the whole idea for this is, despite the fact that you have this tool that you can work with, it also works with the multi-frame, okay? So this also works with the multi-frame, and it's pretty nice. But for those who don't know about the previous way that you can actually do your interpolation, how you can interpolate between two frames is as simple as going over to draw, go over to interpolate sequence, click on that, and right here you can actually have this. You'd also notice, so let's undo that, a little bit, you would also notice if you go over to the interpolate and click on this interpolate sequence operator right here, you can choose to play with the steps. You can also choose to play with the interpolation type, and you can also play with the selected stroke. All right, so if you want the selected stroke to be active, of course you can work with those and get some good results from them. What they've also done is if you go over to your edit section, you can also do these things by simply selecting individual objects. Okay, so you can select this object, go over to this other one, select it, and try and make sure that you have them selected within, you know, your timeline. They have to be selected within the timeline, and that also makes sense. So once you do that, if you go over to your grease pencil and go over to interpolate sequence, you can also get that same interpolating sequence feature right here, and this makes a lot of sense once you're working with a whole object. So with all those beautiful things said, let's talk about something that Pablo is currently working on. So he did tease this one on his Twitter page, which deals with the face set extrude. And for me, I kind of like this one since it deals with the face set. It simply means that you can select certain parts alongside with the sculpt expand, which he already talked about, and then you can extrude those parts. And I think the sculpt room is looking like a very nice place to spend most of your time when working with Blender. Currently, he has also made a couple of things which are now available in master, and they deal with the random per face set selection and also the random per loose part selection. Now these things do work with both the color filter and also the mesh filter. But one thing to keep in mind is these are also masked and you can use them to your advantage. And it's very interesting to see that we're getting some pretty cool updates to the sculpt room. And speaking about the sculpt room, there is also the unify Interpol detail size operator that should be coming, or maybe is presently here. So for those who would like to read more about this one, you can simply go ahead and take a look at this. And as well, for those who would want to read up on this mask initial operator, you might want to also take a look at the link in the description and, you know, read this one through. Now with that said as well, there is also some pretty cool updates with Eevee. So we've already talked about Eevee, the depth of field. Now there is an update to the ambient occlusion and also rendering with volumetrics. So for those who like to render with volumetrics, maybe you want to render Eevee with stuff like this, you can simply come through and read this one up. And then there is a very tiny implementation which might be coming over to Blender pretty soon. And it has to do with the fact that there is a pretty cool add support to mute node wires. Now, contrary to muting your entire node, or let's say you kind of delete the node, at this point they are looking at ways that you can just simply mute your node wires, your node connectors and stuff like that. For me, I think this might be very cool, although this isn't just something that started out maybe yesterday or 2 days ago. It has actually been talked about since 2017, and hopefully this is going to be implemented. And of course, you can actually take a look and see what's going on here. And I did try to see if this is currently in the new version, which I just downloaded a couple of minutes ago, and it doesn't exist in that yet. So hopefully this might be coming over to Blender 2.93 as an additional update before the final release. And for those who like to read more about this and also see when, you know, the conversation of this one started, you can also go over to this link, which is sensormusic.org, and read some of these things up. I mean, you can take a look at the old UI and you can tell that this is actually something that has been talked about for a very long time. So 2015 seems to be a very good time to get inspired for things to happen in 2021, and that's more like it. So for those who would also want to, you know, get some pretty cool updates on wires, since we're talking about cables, there's an update that deals with the terrain mixer. So the folks at Zets, they have actually updated the terrain mixer to 1.9.1. so terrain mixer actually mimics what you can get with the quad spinner gear, and it's just pretty cool. So in case you want to create your own terrains by simply using procedural nodes, and maybe you want to get something that is all the way to 8K and 16K, you might want to take a look at this one and see what you can get with it. So let's talk about one quick thing before we go. If you take a look at what we have here, it's quite simple. So what we have going on here is just a simple line like we've talked about. So you can see we're just using the line to do this, and then we just have the cube, which just deals with the size of all of those things that's going on. And then finally we have the geometry stuff, which deals with the point to volume, and finally volume to point. And the idea for me showing you guys this thing is there's a tiny tip that I think might be worth it. And this is the fact that you already know that in most cases recently, all right, in most cases you can just go in and just hit the apply button. But what if you like to texture this right here within the geometry node. So if you go over to your materials section, you click down here, you can switch this to object. And once you switch it to object and click on new, you'd now notice that you have a new section. Now this creates a brand new material which doesn't deal with the data but deals with the object. So what does this mean? If we click on this button and now select this and change it to red and switch over here, you would now notice that we have our object in that particular color. So let's actually take a look. So you notice that we have it in this particular color. So it simply means that right now you can go in and now make color changes to your model. So depending on what you want to do, you can go in there and start creating some cool things for yourself. And I just felt like, you know, this is something that you guys might find interesting, especially if you would like to start creating some stuff and you want to texture this. You can go in there and start throwing that texture right onto the model that you're working on right now. So it's just a tiny tip, and I felt maybe it's going to be nice for the community to know that this is something that actually exists. So this is more like it. And for those who like to join World Blender Meetup Day, there's going to be a link in the description to catch up with this, and so that you can also watch the streamed event. And for those who like to grab a brand new copy of Blender 2.93, link to that is also going to be in the description. So do well to check these things out. Tell me what you guys think about this one in the comment section. And of course, if you like this video or you learned something from this, you can go ahead and give it a like, and don't forget to share with a friend. And if you're new here, it's going to be amazing for you to hit the subscribe button and also turn on notifications so that you don't miss the next video or the next update. And until I see you guys again with a tutorial update, Free Friday, Tutorial Tuesday, tips and tricks, things like this. Peace.